Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be focusing on Ukraine, not the battlefield, though, but public opinion. And specifically, we're going to be looking at reactions to Ukrainian President Zelensky's take on corruption, particularly what he said in a recent interview with Lex Fridman. Our sources for this deep dive, well, excerpts from news articles that are reporting on the interview. And the real goldmine here are the reader comments. Those unfiltered gems, They can really tell us a lot about what people are actually thinking.
It's crazy how much insight you can get from those reader comments sometimes.
Yeah.
And traditional news gives us the official line, but to read what everyday people are saying can be incredibly revealing, especially in a situation, as complex and as sensitive as the conflict in Ukraine.
Absolutely. And to kind of give everybody the background here, Fridman asked Zelensky directly about accusations of corruption.
Yeah.
These accusations have been swirling around Ukraine, and particularly the use of international aid. We have to remember this interview is happening during a very active conflict. So, tensions are high, to say the least.
Right. You can't underestimate how much weight each word carries in this kind of situation. The whole world is watching, and Zelensky's statements have the potential to impact everything, from troop morale to international support.
Exactly. And so how does Zelensky respond to this very direct question about corruption?
Well, he makes a few key points.
Yeah.
First, he emphasizes that most of the aid that Ukraine has received has mostly been in the form of weapons, not cash. And then he goes on to say, I'm quoting here, that they beat on the hands of anyone who's trying to profit from the war, and they will continue to do so.
That's an interesting strategy. So emphasizing weapons over the financial aid, he's essentially saying, look, we're not swimming in cash here, so the opportunities for large-scale corruption are limited. But then, he follows that up with that very strong statement about cracking down on anyone trying to profit from the war. So it's a way of acknowledging that, attempts at corruption may exist, but they're dealing with them swiftly and decisively. And that's where things get really interesting. Because of the public reaction that we're seeing, particularly in the comments sections of these articles, let's just say a lot of people aren't buying it.
Yeah, there's this palpable sense of skepticism in the comments. People are accusing Zelensky of downplaying the corruption problem. And some are even going so far as to say that he is being dishonest. I think it really gives you a sense of this erosion of trust that's happening even while this war is going on.
You can almost feel the frustration kind of radiating through the screen when you read some of these.
Exactly. And that lack of trust that you see in the comments, well, that must have very real consequences for Ukraine. It could directly impact whether they continue to receive the level of international aid they need to continue fighting this war.
Oh, wow. That's a really good point. I hadn't thought about it like that before. So we're not just talking about hurt feelings here. This is something that could potentially impact the course of the war itself.
Absolutely. One of the things that makes these comments so fascinating to me is the rawness of the emotion behind them. It's not just political disagreement. It's anger, it's disappointment, a sense of betrayal even.
Yeah, I was going to say some of these comments are brutal.
They are brutal. For example, one commenter just flat out accuses Zelensky of personally profiting from the war. And then another one, and this one, it kind of stings. This one compares him to a clown, referencing, his career as a comedian before becoming president.
Ouch. Yeah, that's harsh. And there are a lot of comments that express concern about how all of this is impacting Ukraine's image on the world stage.
Right. Some people are saying, even if some of these accusations are not true, just the perception of corruption will hurt Ukraine in the long run.
Okay, so we've got Zelensky's position on this whole corruption issue, and we have this tidal wave of public skepticism coming up against it. What does this mean for this situation in Ukraine?
Well, I think on one level, this reveals a deep mistrust of the government. And that's never good. But it's especially bad during a war where unity is so crucial.
It's like trying to build a stronger house, but the foundation is cracking at the same time.
Yeah, a perfect analogy. And even though, these comments are just a snapshot of public opinion, they do highlight a potential disconnect between the leadership and the people.
A disconnect that could have major implications for Ukraine's future, both during and after the war.
Absolutely. And that brings us to something really important to remember. While many of the comments that we've seen are highly critical of Zelensky, you also see another theme emerging in these comments. There are a lot of people who are essentially saying, look, we know there might be corruption, but can we please just focus on winning this war first?
Okay.
Deal with the internal issues later.
Right. It's like they're prioritizing survival over accountability right now. Like, we'll have this reckoning later, but let's just get through this first.
Exactly. And I think that speaks to another layer of complexity in all of this. War fatigue. People are tired. They're scared. And they just want this to be over. And it makes you wonder how much patience they have left for these issues, even if they believe that they're important.
Right. It's like there's this ticking clock in the background, and it's adding even more pressure to this incredibly tense situation.
Exactly. And that's why understanding these diverse reactions is so important. It's not just about Zelensky or corruption. It's about the emotional and psychological toll that this war is taking on the Ukrainian people.
Yeah, it really does paint a picture of a society under immense strain. I mean, imagine you're living through a war, your whole life is constantly disrupted, and then you see these reports about potential corruption. I mean, it's easy to understand why people would be so disillusioned.
Yeah, that comment about Zelensky being like a changed president, that one really stuck with me. And I think it gets to the heart of something important about how people view him now. He came into office with this image of an outsider, a fresh start. Somebody who wasn't part of that old corrupt system. Right, exactly. He was the comedian turned president. This symbol of hope and change for a lot of people. And now for many, that hope seems to be fading. They're seeing him as just another politician, maybe even part of the problem.
It's almost Shakespearean, right? The hero who falls from grace.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it raises an important question. How do you maintain that public trust when you're leading a country through a war, especially when you're having to make incredibly difficult decisions, often with limited information?
Right. You're walking a tightrope while being pelted with tomatoes. No matter what you do, someone's going to be unhappy. That pressure has got to be immense, especially when you're dealing with a global spotlight like Zelensky is.
Absolutely. And it's not just about making the right decisions. It's about communicating them effectively. I mean, Zelensky's been praised for his communication skills, especially on the international stage. But, as we're seeing from these comments, that message isn't always resonating with his own people.
And that disconnect, whether it's real or perceived, that can be so damaging. It can undermine the support for the war effort, weaken his political standing. It could even impact international aid.
You hit the nail on the head. There's a comment that I think really illustrates this point perfectly. It says, and I'm paraphrasing here, this whole interview felt staged, like he's more focused on lobbying the Americans than actually leading our country.
Wow, that's harsh.
Yeah, but it speaks to a wider concern about how Zelensky is handling the war. Yeah, there's this perception among some that he's prioritizing image over substance, that he's playing the role of a wartime leader for the cameras, but neglecting the real needs of his people.
And that perception, whether it's fair or not, can be so dangerous. Because once that seed of doubt is planted, it can be really hard to uproot it.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to remember that we're only seeing a tiny piece of the picture here. Public opinion is complex and it's multifaceted. There are likely many Ukrainians who continue to support Zelensky and believe that he is doing the absolute best he can in a really impossible situation.
That's a really good point. We can't let the negativity in some of these comments overshadow the fact that there are probably many people who still have faith in him.
Right. And we also need to consider the impact of wartime propaganda and disinformation. It's entirely possible that some of these comments are being amplified or even orchestrated by forces who, want to see Zelensky weakened or removed from power.
Yeah, that adds another layer of complexity to all of this, doesn't it? It's like trying to solve a puzzle where some of the pieces are intentionally designed to mislead you.
Exactly. So what can we as informed observers do? I think we need to be very careful about drawing any definitive conclusions, especially when we're working with a limited data set like this. It's important to consider the source of the information, the potential biases at play, and the broader context in which these comments are being made.
So essentially, we need to be critical thinkers, not just passive consumers of information. We need to ask questions, challenge assumptions, and be open to the possibility that the truth might be more complicated than any single narrative suggests.
Right. And that's what makes these deep dives so valuable. It's not about, trying to find easy answers. It's about grappling with the complexities and the ambiguities, the gray areas. I mean, that's where the real learning happens.
Okay, I want to go back to the reader comments for a second. There's one that really stood out to me, and it's pretty intense. This one says, Zelensky is a cynical liar and a thief of the highest grade. He's a traitor who's destroying Ukraine. I hope to see him imprisoned for life.
Wow. Okay. That comment, while extreme, it reflects a level of anger and disillusionment that we can't just ignore. It speaks to a deep sense of betrayal, that the leader they trusted has let them down.
And those kinds of feelings, even if they're only held by a minority, they can be incredibly volatile. They can lead to social unrest, political instability, even violence. It's a warning sign that something is really wrong.
Exactly. And I think it really underscores the importance of understanding these diverse perspectives. Even the most extreme viewpoints can offer really valuable insights into the social and psychological dynamics that are at play.
So where do we go from here? What does all this mean for the future of Ukraine?
Yeah, that is the million-dollar question, isn't it? We've explored Zelensky's stance, and we've gone deep into those raw and unfiltered public reactions. And we've definitely uncovered some pretty complex layers of emotion and mistrust and war fatigue.
If there's one key takeaway from all of this, I think it's that we need to be incredibly cautious about, forming these simplistic narratives. The situation in Ukraine is far too nuanced, far too multifaceted to be reduced to, these simple sound bites or social media posts.
Right. Like we've been saying throughout this whole deep dive, context is everything. We can't just, look at these reader comments in isolation. We need to consider the broader historical and political and social forces that are shaping people's perceptions.
Absolutely. And we also need to acknowledge, the limitations of our own understanding. We're not on the ground in Ukraine. We're not experiencing this war firsthand. So our insights are based on the information that we have available to us. And that information is inherently, incomplete. It's like we're trying to put together a puzzle, but we only have half of the pieces. We might be able to see the general outline, but there are always going to be gaps in our knowledge.
And those gaps are where misinformation and disinformation can thrive. When people are desperate for answers, they're more likely to believe anything that confirms their existing biases or their fears.
Which brings us back to, the importance of critical thinking. We need to constantly question the information that we're taking in, especially in a situation as volatile and emotionally charged as this one.
Exactly. And that means being willing to consider multiple perspectives, even the ones that make us uncomfortable or challenge our preconceived notions.
And that's where I think these comments, even the really negative ones, can actually be valuable. They force us to confront the reality that not everybody sees the world the same way we do.
Right. They remind us that public opinion is never monolithic. There will always be different viewpoints, competing narratives, conflicting emotions, and that's okay. In fact, that's essential for a healthy democracy.
It's like we're looking through a kaleidoscope. Every time you twist it, you see a different pattern, you get a different perspective on the same complex reality.
That's a beautiful analogy. As we continue to follow the events in Ukraine, it's crucial to remember that complexity, to resist the temptation to oversimplify or to demonize, to reduce everything to just black and white.
Because ultimately, the more we understand the nuances, the better equipped we are to engage in a meaningful dialogue, to empathize with the people who are suffering, and to contribute to a more peaceful and just world.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. But before we go, I want to leave you with one final thought to ponder. We've explored the public's perception of corruption in Ukraine. But what about our own perceptions? How do our own biases and experiences shape our own understanding of this conflict? Are we truly open to challenging our assumptions? Or are we just seeking confirmation of what we already believe?
It's a really tough question, but definitely one worth asking ourselves as we try to navigate this complex and ever-changing world. So until next time, keep diving deep, keep asking those tough questions, and keep striving for that more nuanced and informed understanding of the world around us.